It started when I saw the ad on a community board at my college. I was desperate for a place to stay. My last living situation had ended suddenly, and I didn't have time to be picky. The ad seemed perfect: affordable rent, close to campus, and the roommate was already set up. The guy's name was Mark, and he described himself as laid back and easygoing. When I first met him, Mark seemed normal enough. He had this quiet, unassuming vibe about him, and the place was tidy. He said he worked odd hours doing some IT job from home, which explained why he was always around. It seemed like a good fit. I moved in the next weekend. At first, things were fine. Mark kept to himself most of the time, but I noticed he had some peculiar habits. He never ate with me or in front of me. I would hear him in the kitchen late at night, rummaging around, but whenever I checked, there'd be no dirty dishes, no evidence that he had eaten at all. He also never left the apartment, at least not that I saw. He said he went out when I was in class, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed unlikely. Then there was the room. Mark had a spare room in the apartment, but he told me it was off limits. He said it was storage and nothing interesting was in there. I didn't think much as in everyone has their quirks. Still, I couldn't help but notice how often he went into that room. Late at night, sometimes for hours. The oddest part was how careful he was about locking it. Every time he came out, he would double-check the lock, twisting the knob 3 or 4 times to make sure it was secure. About a month in, I started noticing other weird things. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel like someone was watching me. I figured it was paranoia or stress, but the feeling persisted. I even thought I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door once or twice, but I convinced myself it was just Mark going to the bathroom. Then my belongings started disappearing. First, it was small stuff, like a phone charger or a sock. I figured it was just misplaced. But then my journal went missing, which was strange because I always kept it in the same spot. When I asked Mark about it, he brushed me off and said he hadn't seen anything. One night, I couldn't sleep. I heard Mark moving around the apartment again, but this time it sounded like he was right outside my door. My heart raced as I listened. The floorboards creaked, and then I heard something else, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails against wood. It went on for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. When I opened my door to check, the hallway was empty, and Mark's bedroom door was closed. I decided to confront him the next day. I asked if he had been outside my door during the night, and he gave me a strange look, almost like he was amused. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. I tried to let it go, but something about the way he looked at me sent chills down my spine. I started locking my door at night after that. It felt silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A week later, I came home from class to find my bedroom door ajar. I always locked it when I left. Inside, my room was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. My pillow was on the floor, and it looked like someone had been lying in my bed. The indentation on the mattress was still visible. When I confronted Mark, he didn't deny it. He just smiled and said I was imagining things. He said he never went into my room, but the way he said it didn't feel convincing. It felt like a lie, and I realized then that I couldn't trust him. I decided to check out the spare room. It was risky, but my gut told me that whatever was going on, the answers were in there. One night, when Mark went into the bathroom, I used the opportunity to sneak a look. I had to move fast. Inside, the room was dark and smelled musty, like old wood and mildew. My phone's flashlight revealed shelves lined with jars. Some were filled with what looked like liquid, others with, I don't even know, pieces of something organic. The walls were covered with pictures of me. Some were from inside the apartment, others from places I'd been around campus. I backed out quickly and tried to act normal for the rest of the night, but I knew I had to leave. The next morning I packed my essentials while Mark was in the shower. I didn't bother saying goodbye. The police didn't take me seriously when I told them what I found. They checked the apartment but said there was nothing illegal about the jars or the pictures. Mark claimed he was doing an art project and had my permission to take the photos. They let him off with a warning. I moved in with a friend after that, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. I kept seeing Mark's face in crowds and feeling like someone was following me. A few weeks later, I got a package in the mail. It didn't have a return address. Inside was my missing journal, and tucked between the pages was a note in Mark's handwriting. It said, "I'll see you soon." When I first moved to the city, I was desperate to save money. Rent was astronomical, and I didn't want to drain my savings. That's how I ended up finding Adam through an online roommate listing. His post seemed normal. He described himself as quiet, clean, and someone who worked nights. I figured we'd barely see each other, which sounded perfect. Adam looked average enough when I met him. He was tall, a bit lanky, and had a mop of dark hair that always looked uncombed. His smile was crooked, but it was disarming in a way. He showed me the room, which was decent enough, and I moved in 2 weeks later. The first month was uneventful. Adam mostly stayed in his room during the day, and I had the apartment to myself. It was exactly what I wanted. Then things started to shift, slowly at first. I began noticing little things, like how Adam would disappear for days without saying anything. I assumed it was work-related until I saw him come back one morning looking disheveled, his clothes streaked with dirt. He didn't explain, just nodded at me and went to his room. I let it slide because I didn't want to pry. We weren't friends, just roommates. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the living room. It was late, probably past midnight, and I assumed Adam was home. The thing was, the footsteps didn't stop. They paced back and forth, slow and deliberate. I finally got up to check, but when I opened my door, the living room was empty. I saw his bedroom door closed, the light seeping out from the crack beneath it. I convinced myself it was my imagination and went back to bed. The next day, I casually mentioned the noise, but he brushed it off. He said he had a habit of walking in his sleep and told me not to worry. He even apologized, which made me feel like I was overreacting. But after that night, I started hearing the pacing more often. It was always around the same time, and it would go on for hours. The turning point came when I found a strange smell in the apartment. It was faint at first, like something rotting, but it grew stronger every day. I tried cleaning everything, the trash, the fridge, even the bathroom drains, but it didn't help. The smell seemed to be coming from Adam's room. I asked him about it and he just smiled and said he'd take care of it. The smell didn't go away though. If anything, it got worse. One night I decided to investigate while Adam was out. I know it was wrong, but I couldn't stand the stench anymore. His door was locked, so I used a credit card to jimmy it open. The smell hit me like a wall the second I stepped inside. His room was dark, but I could make out piles of random junk, papers, old clothes, and what looked like dead plants. In the corner, there was a large black trunk, and the smell seemed to be coming from it. I didn't open the trunk. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about the way it sat there, so still and ominous, made my stomach churn. I backed out of the room and shut the door, locking it again as best I could. When Adam came home later that night, I pretended to be asleep, but I could hear him in his room, moving things around. It sounded like he was dragging something heavy. After that, things escalated. Adam started acting differently, almost like he knew I'd been in his room. He would stare at me for too long, his eyes unblinking, and his smile didn't seem friendly anymore. He began leaving little notes around the apartment, saying things like, "Keep your nose out of my business," or "You're not safe here." At first I thought I was imagining it, but I found one tucked into my bag at work. That's when I knew it wasn't just paranoia. I tried to confront him about the notes, but he denied everything. He said I was being paranoid and laughed it off, but there was something in his laugh that felt wrong, almost mocking. That night I locked my bedroom door and pushed my dresser in front of it, just in case. I didn't sleep much after that. Every night I'd hear the pacing in the living room, followed by the sound of Adam's door creaking open. I couldn't bring myself to check anymore. I just lay there clutching my phone, wondering if I should call someone. But what could I say? That my roommate was creepy? That he might be leaving me threatening notes? It all sounded so ridiculous when I said it out loud. The last night I spent in that apartment was the worst. I woke up to the sound of scratching at my door, slow and deliberate. My heart was racing as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The scratching stopped, and then I heard Adam's voice. He was whispering something, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded almost like he was chanting. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but before I could hit call, the scratching stopped. Everything went silent. I stayed frozen in bed, waiting, until I heard his door slam shut. That was it for me. I packed a bag, waited until morning, and left without saying a word. I never went back. A week later, I got a call from the landlord. He told me Adam had vanished. When they went to clean out the apartment, they found the trunk in his room. I didn't ask what was inside. I didn't want to know. All I know is that I never saw Adam again, and I'm okay with that. There was some. I never thought much about having a roommate. I was in college, living in a small apartment off campus, and the rent was expensive. When the opportunity to split it with someone came up, I jumped at the chance. I met Brian through a mutual friend, and he seemed like a solid choice. He was quiet, polite, and seemed respectful of boundaries. He told me that he worked at a local cafe and had his own life, which was perfect. I liked my privacy. We both agreed to leave each other alone when it came to personal time. It felt like it would be easy, and I had no reason to think otherwise. At first, things were uneventful. Brian would come home late, always a little tired but never too chatty. He kept to himself and spent most of his time in his room. He would leave early every morning, and I barely noticed he was even there. But over time, small things started happening that I couldn't explain. I would come home and find the kitchen lights on, even though I knew I'd turned them off before I left. Or my books would be moved around, sometimes even stacked in neat piles. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. Maybe I had left things out of place. But there were too many little things that didn't sit right with me. One night I came home and immediately noticed the smell. It was strange, almost like something metallic mixed with rot. I didn't think much of it at first, just assumed it was the food Brian had been cooking. When I walked past his room, I could hear him talking to someone. Not in a normal way, though. It was like he was whispering, but there was no one else in the apartment. I knocked on his door, asking if everything was all right. He answered quickly, and his face looked flushed. He told me he was just on the phone with his mom, and that it was nothing. The following week, the oddities became harder to ignore. I woke up one morning to find the bathroom light on, and the mirror was covered in what looked like fingerprints, small, hand-shaped smudges. I was the only one who used the bathroom, so I couldn't explain it. When I asked Brian if he had used the bathroom, he seemed irritated, as if I were accusing him of something. He quickly said that he hadn't, and left without another word. Then came the night I couldn't dismiss it any longer. I had stayed late at the library, and when I came back to the apartment, the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and for the first time I didn't hear the usual sounds of Brian's music or his TV. It was eerily silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I made my way into the living room. Everything looked normal at first. The couch cushions were undisturbed, the coffee table clean. But then I looked toward the hallway and saw that the door to Brian's room was open, and the light inside was on. I stood there frozen, listening. I could hear Brian, but his voice was different. There was something wrong. It wasn't the soft muttering I had become accustomed to. It was harsher, almost like chanting. a low, rhythmic sound that made my skin crawl. I hesitated for a moment before creeping closer to the door. When I peered inside, I saw him sitting in front of his computer screen, hunched over, his fingers moving in an unnatural way across the keyboard. His face was illuminated by the glow of the monitor, but it wasn't his usual calm expression. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his lips trembled as he whispered words I couldn't quite make out. I felt my stomach twist with nausea as I watched him, unsure of what to do. I wanted to call out to him, to ask what was going on, but something stopped me. It felt like if I broke the silence, something terrible would happen. I decided to leave the apartment and go for a walk to clear my head. When I returned, Brian was gone, his room empty. It was as if he had never been there. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but the unease lingered in my chest. The next morning, things took a darker turn. I woke up to find Brian sitting in the living room when I came out of my room. He wasn't watching TV or scrolling through his phone, though. He was staring at me, not blinking, not moving. His eyes were fixed on me in a way that made my skin prickle with discomfort. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he slowly stood up and walked toward me. The way he moved was wrong, like he wasn't fully in control of his body. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and distant. He told me that I didn't need to worry about anything, that everything was under control. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and his words felt empty. I backed away, not sure what to say, but he didn't seem to care. He continued to tell me that I wouldn't understand, that I wasn't supposed to understand. It wasn't until he looked down at his hands, gripping them into tight fists, that I saw the blood. There was blood on his shirt, smeared down his arms. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at him, trying to process what I was seeing. I demanded to know what happened. His smile faded, and his eyes darkened. He said nothing, just turned and walked into his room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. That was the last time I saw him. I left the apartment that day, and when I contacted the landlord, I found out that Brian had never existed. There was no record of him ever renting the apartment. No one knew who he was or how he got in. I called the police, but they couldn't find any trace of him. They said it was likely that I had imagined it all, that I was under stress, but I know what I saw. I know what he did. I don't know what happened to Brian, but I'll never forget the feeling of his eyes on me, the way he stared like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. And now, every time I walk into a room alone, I feel that same unsettling chill crawl down my spine, as if he's still out there watching me. I wasn't desperate when I decided to get a roommate. At least I didn't think I was. Rent in the city was expensive, and I figured it would be nice to have some company. The ad I posted was pretty straightforward. I asked for someone quiet, responsible, and respectful of personal space. That's how I ended up with Mara. Mara seemed normal when I first met her. She showed up wearing a big sweater and carrying a coffee cup like she was in some kind of indie movie. She told me she worked odd hours but was quiet and kept to herself. I liked that. I liked that she didn't seem too eager to be friends, because I wasn't looking for a new bestie. We shook hands and she moved in 3 days later. At first, everything was fine. Mara mostly stayed in her room. I'd see her in the kitchen sometimes, always late at night. She'd be standing by the sink, staring out the window with a cup of tea. I'd nod at her and she'd nod back. It was peaceful. Quiet, just what I wanted. Things started to feel off after the first couple of weeks. I noticed that Mara was gone a lot, which wasn't strange on its own. What was weird was how she always seemed to come back with dirt on her shoes and scratches on her hands. I asked her if she was okay one night when she came in late, and she just shrugged and said she liked going for walks in the woods. I didn't press her on it, but the way she said it made me uneasy. Then there was the smell. It started in the hallway outside her room, this faint, sour odor that got worse every day. I thought maybe she had left food out or forgotten to take out her trash. I knocked on her door and told her about it, but she just said she'd take care of it. The smell didn't go away, though. It only got stronger. One night I decided to check while she was out. I know it was wrong, but I couldn't stand it anymore. Her door wasn't locked, so I pushed it open just a crack. The smell hit me like a punch to the face. It was worse than I imagined, like rotting meat mixed with something chemical. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. I just shut the door and went back to my room, my heart pounding. That's when the noises started. At first, it was just soft scraping sounds coming from her room late at night. I told myself it was nothing, maybe her moving furniture or unpacking boxes. But then I heard what sounded like whispering. It was low and fast, like she was talking to someone, but I never heard anyone else respond. I couldn't make out the words, but it made my skin crawl. One night I woke up around 3 a.m. to a loud thud. It sounded like something heavy hitting the floor. I sat up in bed, listening, but everything was quiet again. The next morning, I noticed a dark stain on the carpet in the hallway outside her door. I didn't say anything to her about it. I didn't want her to know I had noticed. Mara started acting stranger after that. She stopped saying hi when we passed each other. Her eyes seemed darker somehow, more hollow. She'd stand in the kitchen for hours, just staring at the wall or the sink. One night I came out of my room to get water, and she was standing there in the dark, facing the fridge. She didn't turn around when I walked past her. She just stood there, completely still. I decided I couldn't live like that anymore. I started looking for a new place to live, but I didn't have enough money saved up to leave right away. I told myself I just needed to tough it out for another month. I tried to avoid Mara as much as possible, keeping my door locked when I was in my room and leaving the apartment whenever I could. Everything came to a head one night when I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, staring at the crack of light under the door. I could see the shadow of feet standing there, not moving. Then I heard the handle jiggle. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I stayed completely still, hoping she'd go away. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow moved, and I heard her footsteps heading back to her room. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found a deep scratch on the outside of my bedroom door, like someone had dragged a knife or a claw down it. I knew it was her. There was no one else it could have been. I confronted her about it that afternoon. I asked her if she'd tried to get into my room last night. She didn't deny it. She just stared at me with this blank expression and said she was sleepwalking. She told me she'd try to be more careful, but the way she said it made my stomach turn. It didn't feel like an apology. It felt like a warning. That was the last straw. I packed a bag that night and left. I stayed with a friend for a few weeks until I could find a new place. I never went back to the apartment, not even to get the rest of my stuff. I told the landlord I'd moved out and that Mara could have the place to herself. I didn't care about the deposit. I just wanted to be done with it. I still don't know what Mara was doing in that apartment. I don't know what was in her room or why she acted the way she did. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes I can't help wondering. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. If I'd stayed just one more night. There was something.